Hello everyone, I hope you're all having a great day so far. My name is JurassicKM and welcome to today's video. In this video, I want to rank and grade each episode of my favorite episodic web series, Death Battle, which started in 2010, but I didn't start watching until 2014. If you don't know, Death Battle is a series where two similar characters are pitted against each other to see who would win in a fight to the death, and the winner is determined through math and science rather than personal opinion or viewer voting. So how's this going to work? Just in case if you aren't familiar with the characters, I will include their name and what intellectual property they're from, unless the IP is the same as their name. Example, Steven Universe, Danny Phantom, Predator, etc. Since I don't watch the show just for the fights, and to make this interesting, I'm going to rank each episode based on how familiar I was with the fighters first going in, how much the rundowns piqued my interest, how entertained I was by the fight itself, and when applicable, how much the original composed track for the fight sweetened the pot. These really came in late season 4. These elements will be graded on a scale of 1 to 4. I will tally that total and figure out the percentage of the total applicable points. Tiebreakers are determined by which episode I'm more likely to rewatch. As such, please note that these percentages do not always reflect my favorite episodes. Quick disclaimer, this video is not meant to troll or trigger anyone, nor is it meant to debunk or debate any results. I am very fortunate that I could say there were only 2 episodes where I said X better win, and they did. Spoilers, it's these 2. Beyond that, I watched the show for entertainment. Also, with such a vast array of properties, genres, and mediums covered, there is no way our lists are going to look the same, so if those episodes you feel strongly about one way or another aren't where you'd rank them, relax. I will also be including an icon of who won or if the battle was a draw, so spoilers ahead. We have almost 200 episodes to go through, so let's speed round these things starting at the bottom. These characters were introduced long after I stopped paying attention to Pokemon and Digimon, but I try to give characters I haven't heard of the benefit of the doubt, and these 2 did nothing for me. This fight also felt very brief, so this one was a snooze for me. This one did nothing for me, and I found it a chore to sit through. Not that I necessarily think it was the case here, but I wonder how many episodes are done where the cast and crew aren't psyched about the matchup, but figure, well, this is what the fans want, so let's give it to them. This is one of many episodes that made me go, who? Now, for the record, I have nothing against anime or manga. They're simply styles, mediums, whatever, for storytelling. But I don't consume a lot of either, and this episode didn't make me want to check out these respective series. Zuko came off as the slightly more interesting of the 2, but it didn't help this episode overall. Moving on. The nicest thing I could say about this episode is that the fight track reminds me of the kind of music you'd hear in Marvel vs. Capcom. Beyond that, this just wasn't an episode for me. Was this a commonly asked for matchup? No offense if anyone was hyped for this one, but as someone who isn't into Sonic and hated Scott Pilgrim, I wanted to clock out by the Blue Apron ad. This matchup worked better as a brief robot chicken cutaway gag. I know that this episode plays into the long-running gag of Boomstick not knowing and trying to find who his dad is, but I really didn't dig this one. Why are the rundowns bouncing back and forth between the 2? Why are we still doing feat comparisons and talking stats during the fight instead of seeing the fight? What even is this episode? I was not into this one at all. Dragon's Dance isn't a bad song, but this was the most boring season finale for me. As a fan of classic rock, I appreciate the foreigner nod at the beginning of the episode. Still, I found this one to be an overall snooze. Credit where it's due, Makuma's story had an interesting ending, but this episode did nothing to pique my interest otherwise. This fight felt far too short as well. I feel like this episode is a bigger deal to the generation that came after mine. I know that makes me sound, and feel, old, but I felt nothing for this one. When this episode premiered, I was so uninterested that I only watched the fight and the next episode announcement. Revisiting it, I see why, and the only reason why it ranks as high as it does is because the battle music, Hollow Dreams, is a pretty good song. This episode is painfully a product of its time, right with late 2000s, early 2010s cynicism. I'm glad that the show doesn't do gag episodes in this style anymore. With this being a sponsored episode to advertise The Boys, it did not feel like the usual Death Battle episode, even having the post-battle analysis be its own video. Maybe I should have skipped this one like I did with the Vegeta vs. Mewtwo / Silvermania jab episode, but this episode was in the 130-some range. I was in too deep at that point. The rundowns felt off to me, with them basically summing up the character's arc right off the hop before going into the specifics of their abilities. They didn't make me invested in the characters and made the fight a bit of a chore to sit through, even if it was as short as it was. A ninja fight sounds great on paper, but this wasn't it. Hayabusa has gone up against more interesting opponents than Hiru, but it wasn't enough to get me invested. If Blaze Blue's world building made more sense and if the fight wasn't anticlimactic, maybe this would have ranked higher. The "that man" bit is a personal favorite rundown gag, though. Man, what a combo breaker after Cage, Falcon, Aang Edward, Ghost Rider Lobo, and Dragonzord Mechagodzilla. Again, I went in with an open mind, but I did not find this to be an interesting episode. Okay, Sephiroth gets a point for the threat of "I will never be a memory" in his rundown, because that line was cold. Having said that, I was not enthusiastic about these characters going in, and I didn't remember anything about the fight as soon as the KO was called. After watching the Stardust Crusaders and Battle in Egypt stuff, I tried going back and watching JoJo's Bizarre Adventures from the beginning, but I found the Jonathan Joestar stuff nowhere near as interesting, and I couldn't even finish it. Sadly, this episode didn't make me want to give it another shot or seek out Demon Slayer. I forgot that this animated fight is a sequel to Hercule Satan vs. Dan Hibiki. Strongest Alive isn't a bad fight track, but that's the most I could say about this episode. I found Mercer a bit more interesting than McGrath, but that only goes so far. This episode got points for being a 3D fight and having Omega Sparks on the fight track, but this just wasn't my bag. I forgot how sadistic Dig Dug's weaponry was, but this episode isn't one that I feel like I'd revisit anytime soon, if ever. Just so we're clear, this is the 2012 episode. This fight was okay, but it only goes so far when it's two characters that I'm not interested in, and this is not an episode that I revisit. I swear I almost fell asleep during this episode. Thank goodness for the fight track Chaos Unraveled, which gives me sweet Killswitch Engage vibes, because if I walked away from this episode of uninteresting edgelord Hedgehog versus uninteresting edgelord barely clothed miner, the rundown states that she's 17, with nothing to show for it, I'd be pretty irked. Neither the daftness that is Kingdom Hearts nor the mythological elements of Kid Icarus could get me invested in these characters. With that being said, not a bad fight though. This is an episode that's just kind of there for me. I never got into either of these franchises, and this episode didn't do anything to entice me further. Again, I never got into either of these characters from the get-go, and this episode didn't make me want to seek them out. Just a meh episode for me. I rolled my eyes at the announcement of this episode, but Bikini Bottom is a product of the Atom? What in the actual... I'd be lying if I said that describing Ichigo's powers as a samurai ghostbuster didn't give me a twinge of curiosity, but there were so many superpowered forms that it all just blended together after a while. The music was pretty good, but this episode just wasn't for me. This one was just another kind of meh episode. However, I think that the hand-drawn animated bits in the fight look pretty good. Yeah, I played some of the Mega Man games as a kid, but it's apparent that I did not play them for the lore. This is an episode that I did not envy the research team on. I know these characters are very important in their respective series, but this episode just felt like filler to me. No disrespect to those who love those two, as I'm pretty sure there are plenty who would consider my favorite episode filler. I don't have any feelings towards this one other than it's there. Moving on. Again, cool moments and feats only go so far with characters that I'm not interested in. I know a lot of people want a rematch for this one, but I'm not pressed either way. This is the 2015 episode. I was not looking forward to this one when it was announced, and upon rewatch, I remember why. While the animation and music is an improvement over the original, the rundowns focus more on the real-world history of the characters and the debates of the matchup itself. Superman acts like such a jerk in the fight that he doesn't feel like Superman, ruining the battle, and it just felt like a bitter follow-up response of, yes, Goku still loses, moving on, despite the summary trying to spin a positive light on it. As awesome as a gun that plays 1812 Overture while shooting is, I felt kind of bored with this one. Not my thing, but I hope plenty of others got a kick out of it. I don't really have any feelings toward this one other than, yeah, that was an episode. It's just there. I never got into Soul Calibur, but it's always a good day when we've got a Killer Instinct fighter in the spotlight, even if the fight swings too quickly in Orchid's favor. I can't help but get a little tired of these older episodes perving on the female characters, but if Ivy is a dominatrix and Orchid's No Mercy consists of her flashing her opponents to death, I guess it makes the most sense here. Apparently, a lot of people want this one redone. I'm not bothered either way since I don't play Final Fantasy, and while the world of Ruby sounds unique, it's not enough to get me to check it out. With that said, this is a fight I found pretty enjoyable despite me going in with the thought of, I don't care. I'm only giving King Mickey a 2 here because while I've obviously heard of Mickey Mouse, I had no idea that the same Mickey from Fantasia became this weird OP God King Emperor. As far as season premieres go, this one was pretty weak to me, and it was not a good omen for this particular season, which actually turned out to be quite possibly my least favorite. If I were on the research team for this episode, I probably would have cried. This fight might be the closest one that isn't an outright tie, dethroning a personal favorite episode of mine, but this one wasn't one I was terribly interested in. This one has a decently paced fight? I'm having a hard time of thinking what to say about this one, aside from more Darkstalkers, please. So let's keep going. This episode was nothing to really write home about, except for the fight. I actually liked how it was a combination of sprite, 3D, and possibly hand-drawn animation. This fight felt really short, and I had a hard time really getting excited for it. Even if Guts had won this one, his first episode was better. I don't remember the world of Persona working like this based on Mitsuru's episode, but maybe that varies depending on the entry. Giorno's rundown tempts me to look into the post-Jotaro vs. Dio stuff, but this fight felt too short. This is probably the most disappointing episode of Death Battle for me, and it only ranks as high as it does due to character familiarity. In hindsight, I suppose I didn't know what I was expecting from the fight, but it wasn't this. The first 45 seconds or so of Goodbye Chimichanga is awesome, though. This episode was more interesting on revisit than when it first premiered. Their arsenals sound pretty cool, so there's that, but this one didn't blow me away. I was expecting a complete nothing burger going in, but was pleasantly surprised to find a perfectly serviceable episode. Blue Team genuinely sounds more interesting than the Red Team, and this episode was okay. Silver gets a point because what do you mean Sonic has crossed paths with Spawn? Also, Hedge of Tomorrow is a banger of a track. This is referring to the 2010 episode, which is also the very first episode of Death Battle. Like Lost Tapes, the first episode carries out its concept well enough, but didn't excite me like later episodes do. However, unlike Lost Tapes, which I do enjoy, Death Battle grew noticeably higher in quality. This one was fine, but the ending of the fight kind of bugged me. I know the animations aren't an exact one-to-one of how the fight would go, but why have the tease of Knuckles' arms burrowing out of the ground when we already saw him get thunderclapped into paste? I'm not crazy about either of these fighters, but I did enjoy the banter between the two. If the fight had been longer, this episode would have ranked higher. The killing blow came a little too quick for me, but pretty solid fight all around. If Atreus fought the god of war as well, I wonder how well he'd do against Kratos. Probably not very. You know, for such ho-hum rundowns, this fight actually felt pretty close. It didn't end up going anywhere, but it got a chuckle out of me. The universe Bucky comes from sounds like it'd be a really entertaining cartoon, whereas Fox's doesn't pique my interest the same way. The fight has a real nice back and forth to it, so at least it has that going for it. Both characters had interesting arsenals, and the fight was decently paced. I'm not about to look up the source materials, but I'm down for either character coming back. It was nice to see hosts Wiz and Boomstick actually test the weapons the combatants use a la Deadliest Warrior, which was an inspiration to Death Battle. They mentioned that the meta is kind of like the Predator, so I wouldn't mind seeing that matchup, even if meta would more than likely prevail. Man, I forgot how brutal this one was. I imagine that if the rundowns weren't so rushed and if I had retained my interest in Pokemon, this would have been much higher. This was a well-animated fight, and I expect no less from Devil Artemis, but this was not an episode I was psyched for. The music complemented it nicely, so I tip my hat to Brandon Yates for that. You know, for two characters who sound pretty interesting, you'd think that they'd have a better episode. I mean, it's fine, but it feels like they deserved better. Honestly, I think the background of why these two shared a name is more interesting than the matchup itself. I'm sure you'll get a win one day, Carol. I wasn't expecting much going into this battle of the perverted mentors. However, I had a pretty good time with this fight, and if the killing blow had made more sense, I would have given the fight a 4 out of 4. This one's not bad. The rundowns didn't make me do cartwheels in anticipation, but all around, this is a pretty solid episode. I can take or leave Star Wars, and I was not sold on Kakashi at all, but man, this is one good-looking 3D fight. Again, Devil Artemis. I like how they tossed aside the usual power-ups since they didn't add anything to the fight that wasn't already covered in Mario vs. Sonic. I also forgot just how long this fight was. Props to this episode for showing the Megazord-esque transformation as instantaneous, which, if I recall correctly, is how it actually is and explains why the monsters don't attack during the Megazord transformation. This fight had an unexpected outcome, to me anyway, but hey, that's the nature of the show. As much as I want to tip my hat to the unexpected matchup, this fight was way too short, and it does not showcase either character's cunning intelligence. This episode seemed kind of random when it was announced, and it still feels like filler. This is the 2013 episode. While I didn't really find these two terribly interesting, I appreciate this episode taking its time to try and cover everything. Compared to other episodes that came before, this one felt like a cinematic event, even if I wasn't the target audience. This one was pretty fun. Guts is terrifying, Nightmare put up a decent fight, and good use of Killer Instinct's Cinder Sprite to stand in for Nightmare's spectral form. This is another episode that people really want to see redone. Personally, I'd rather see other Team Fortress 2 characters featured first, as I wasn't bothered by the outcome, but I'm not opposed to it either. My brother was more the Metal Gear player, and neither of us got into Splinter Cell, but despite me not really having any stakes in this race, I found this to be a pretty solid episode. This fight is more up my daughter's alley, but it sounded like it had potential, especially after the absolutely insane Fall Guys lore. The end result was kind of a mixed bag for me, though. Not the best season finale. I wonder just how requested this matchup was. I knew that Stitch was some freaky alien experiment, but I had no idea he was that OP. This was the first episode to be aired after the shutdown of Rooster Teeth and the Kickstarter campaign's completion to help Death Battle go independent. This one was fine. An evil version of Superman vs. Goku, to oversimplify it, and I do like how the music composed by Brandon Yates feels like a companion piece to the song that he composed for Omni-Man vs. Homelander. This is for the 2021 episode. I wasn't terribly interested in this rematch, but I do like this one more than the original. It's a much more interesting fight, and the music is great. The animation for this fight looks better than I remember. This one, much like Blake versus Mikasa, is also one that I found better on rewatch, so that's nice. Not Venom's best episode, but not a terrible episode either. As far as spoopy matchups go, you could do worse. I had no stakes in this particular fight, but this was a pretty good season finale. This was also, to my knowledge, the first time Brandon Yates and Therwolf Media teamed up to compose a track. Like my buddy said, not to imply any kind of exterior influence, but that was an entertaining commercial for Warframe. However, did we need two separate segments comparing the two fighters at the same time before the battle? Killer battle track, though. Again, I could take or leave Star Wars, but I've never liked Harry Potter, and this was an okay episode. I imagine a lot of people would probably like to see a remaster or a rematch of this one. This fight was pretty short, but with this kind of matchup, what else would happen? This episode is fine, I guess, ranking higher due to character familiarity. I imagine that if this one was remade, the results would be very different. The 80s absurdity is rampant in this episode, and that's not a bad thing. The absurdity in their abilities actually makes this match feel pretty even, despite that not being the case. I can appreciate the suspense and evenly matched aspect of this fight, but it needed to be longer. Might be worth a rematch? Who knew ponies were so friggin' OP? I'm curious to see how a rematch of this one would go. This battle was fine, I guess. I just wish that the killing blow was more clear. This episode's not bad, but it's not my favorite boss fight episode. Ganon's second episode was way better. Battle of the Martial Art Nincompoops. The fight did get a little too slapstick for me by the end, but hey, I was still entertained. When I watched this episode when it first premiered, I honestly thought Vader had it in the bag. My God, Doom is OP. My Mario Kart / Mario Party main versus my OG Killer Instinct main. This was fun. A rematch would be a total stomp with Yoshi scaling to the Mario Brothers, so let's bring Riptor back to fight the Indoraptor instead. I found myself more entertained by the combatants breaking into other episodes than I remember. Deadpool's second appearance on Death Battle is a memorable one. Okay, this fight was great, with a lot of back and forth and an absolutely gnarly kill animation. I also find it amusing that the episode that immediately followed this one featured two ice-centered characters. I never really got into either of these characters, but the matchup sounded interesting. It's really too bad that the fight was way too short. This is another one where the fight felt too short, and the vocals for Suit Yourself didn't sit right with me. The characters and arsenals aren't bad, but this just wasn't their episode. I know Death Battle likes to pay tribute to the character's source material, but it didn't work here. Look, I came here to see Jason Voorhees and Michael Myers wail on each other, not focus more on the lone teen survivor trying to escape them. I can watch the movies for that. Going in on Revisit, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was Batman vs. Spider-Man 2, but I really wanted this episode to stand on its own. Both are interesting characters, and the fight animation is really good, again, as is to be expected from Devil Artemis, but not the best overall episode. I feel like this is a good episode if you want to melt your brain with the feet measurements. After hearing the phrase Care Bear Viet Cong, I can't look at Sonic's resistance forces the same way. This is for the 2018 episode. I guess I can see why this was the 100th episode, especially in the season of the most requested matchups, but I do like the original version more. Wow, Dark Souls lore is friggin' bleak. Anyway, my wife and daughter play Skyrim, so I was happy for them when Dragonborn pulled off the win here. This one is a perfectly good season finale. I knew Dragon Ball characters were OP, but I had no idea there would be such a power difference between legendary Super Saiyan Broly and World Breaker Hulk. Infection Perfection is what really sells this matchup for me. There are some cool moments and powers throughout, but the fight did feel a little too short. Usually I'm not a fan of battles where one fighter lands way more hits than the other, but it made sense to me here. Gotta hand it to Carnage, though. He took the loss in stride. Dang, DDD is kind of a powerhouse. And death by corking? Ouch! For not being terribly familiar with these characters, this was a really good episode. The animation is smooth, there's some pretty cool powers on display, and Theirwolf Media's Elements of Alchemy takes it up a level. I guess there was really only one way this was gonna go. This episode tempts me to check out Invincible and The Boys, but I haven't committed yet, and at this point, I'm probably not going to. I knew nothing of these two, but what a cool episode. No pun intended. I'm not gonna lie, I'm tempted to look up Akame ga Kill just to see Esdeath's lunacy in context. A friend of mine tried to sell me on JoJo, but I couldn't grasp what he was explaining until I saw this episode, which made me seek out the Stardust Crusaders arc. What holds this one back for me a bit is that Kenshiro's rundown doesn't go over any weaknesses, probably because it appears he doesn't have any, so it loses any stakes going into the fight itself. The first few blows are hilarious, like base form Agumon isn't even a factor in this fight. This was a pretty fun and near the end brutal battle, but I would have liked to see Tai land some more punches against Red, just for giggles. This one was fine. Not Leonardo's best episode, but the rundowns did get me invested. This is the 2015 episode. There we go. The rundowns made the characters more interesting, and the fight was a huge improvement over the original. This is the 2011 episode. This is a pretty solid matchup between the two biggest mascots of gaming. Really, I had a good time with this one. Of all of the episodes, this is the one that I want to see rematched the most, and I'm glad that it won the Kickstarter rematch vote. This original is still a perfectly entertaining episode, but I'm really looking forward to the rematch. I think what prevents the fight from being a 4 out of 4 is how Nathan croaks from a side effect of Laura's strike, not directly from her strike. Pretty strong start to Season 4. Okay, I had no idea Scrooge McDuck's feats were this bonkers. This fight may swing a little too quick in Scrooge's favor, but it makes up for it by having a surprisingly brutal finish. I was not expecting this. Not just because I didn't expect Kirby to win, but I also didn't expect him to be so friggin' terrifying. This was a pretty good episode all around. I'm not upset with the results, but going in when it first premiered, I figured Green Arrow had it. Credit where it's due. The feats for these two are absolutely nuts. I know that you could apply that statement to just about any episode of Death Battle, but it really hit me with the Season 3 premiere, and that made this fight pretty cool. I had no idea Martian Manhunter's origins were that sad. My God. I was somewhat familiar with these characters, and I really dug their rundowns, but for characters who are capable of wielding such power, this fight felt frustratingly underwhelming. This one was better than I anticipated. A pleasant surprise, a surprising outcome, but not Thor's best episode. This is another episode that fared better on a second viewing. Pretty solid fight, great animation, and another cameo from the cabbage salesman. I never got into Rick and Morty, and my wife was more of a fan of the 9th Doctor rather than the 10th they used for the fight animation, but this was still a pretty good episode. Wubba Dubba Alon Z is an earworm, though. The use of sprite character models on 3D rendered environments really stood out to me here, even if it isn't the first time the show has done this. Also, what a gnarly ending. This is the 2023 episode. Okay, folks, this was the best version of the 3 times this matchup happened. It has a good fight track, and it has the most wholesome way of Superman claiming victory over Goku. I don't care if they said, let's go again, can we please put this one to rest now? Full disclosure, this matchup is more up my wife's alley, but I was really looking forward to it because it was something different. If you like either of these franchises, look this one up. Upon revisit, it's a shame that a good chunk of the Rangers' rundown was muted due to copyright, but this is still a really good episode. The fight animation has a nice back and forth to it, and Brandon Yates and Mason Lieberman strong together gives it an extra kick. I love the tension in this battle. The bit with their arms coming off was nasty, but it paid off for a great conclusion. What holds this one back is the fight itself. Much like the fight in Jurassic Park 3, Cap seems to be in control until Batman gets a few cheap shots in when it should have been more balanced. Again, this one's another perfectly fine episode. It ranks as high as it does due to character familiarity, but it isn't one that I revisit much. Robot army fight! I can always appreciate a vast arsenal for both combatants. In this case, the arsenal are combatants in their own right, and the outcome made me laugh. This battle has a good fake out, but was a little too short for me. Still, this episode got us one step closer to having every Killer Instinct character on this show, which is something I'd like to see eventually. Heck, I would honestly pay good money just to have a Mortal Kombat vs. Killer Instinct game. This is a winner of a gag episode. The history behind these characters is neat, and the fight was really amusing, but in hindsight, a bear with a shovel and reality warping powers versus a dog in a trench coat with a monster truck. Yeah, Quicksilver was screwed from the start, but I get the appeal for the matchup. I also had no idea that Quicksilver's backstory was that messed up. This episode has easily one of the best end of the fight lines ever. Going in, I thought this was going to be a complete stomp, but I didn't know about the Everyman Project, which gave Lex Luthor a bit of a fighting chance. This was a really interesting concept, and I hope they do more episodes of mythological figures from across history. Maybe someday cryptids? Please? Okay, I totally get why this was a highly requested episode. These two characters have crazy powers, and it proved to be a really entertaining fight. I knew nothing of Sega de Sanshiro, but I had bought one of the Chuck Norris joke books for a friend. His wife hated me for it. Sorry, Crystal. This is how you do a gag episode. To be fully transparent, I am one of those people who thought Aquaman was a complete joke. Boy, this episode had me singing a different tune, and this matchup, at least at surface level, felt pretty close. I know that OP doesn't really begin to touch these two, but good God, this episode was something. I hope the research teams were well compensated for their efforts here. Upon revisit, this one surprised me with how well I thought it held up. I would not mind seeing this one redone, even if the results don't change. With characters like these, I don't envy the research teams. This fight was pretty cool, but a few more reality-breaking moments would have put it at a 4 out of 4. I would have liked to see more of the power of nothingness used in the battle, but this fight looked so smooth, I won't consider it detriment. I wasn't super psyched going in, but I was pleasantly surprised. This bonus episode was a welcome addition to the show. The chaos during the bridge alone makes this worth the watch. This is a really good episode, and I wouldn't have minded if Genos pulled off the win. The fight track, KO Computer, has a nice Unleash the Archers vibe to me, so that certainly doesn't hurt. Well, this was a stomp, and the fact that Machamps are just wandering around in the world of Pokemon is downright scary. I know nobody had a great year in 2020, but Mortal Kombat definitely did not have a good year on Death Battle in 2020. This is the second live-action Death Battle, and this one was better than I remember it being. Ismahawk is 2 for 2 on this show, as far as I'm concerned. I'm hard-pressed to think of a time a combatant was so pleased when they knew they had their opponent dead to rights. One of my favorite kills on the show. My favorite Avenger versus my Mortal Kombat 2 main. This fight was fun, even if it turned out to be pretty one-sided. I know this episode came out when YouTube videos could only be a certain length, but man, the rundowns are rushed on this one. I don't appreciate the blatant negativity towards Michelangelo in his rundown, even if he isn't my favorite turtle, but overall, I still wouldn't call this a bad episode. Okay, so the expanded lore of F-Zero is absolutely nuts. While I wish that Falcon had finished Cage on top of the Blue Falcon rather than softening him up with it, I guess it is part of Captain Falcon's regular arsenal, so I suppose it makes sense. Revisiting this episode, I am so glad that Ismahawk is coming back to do another live-action fight in the future, hopefully going 3 for 3. When I first watched this one, I had no idea who was going to come out on top. A very controversial episode with one of the highest dislike rates. I wasn't bothered because I didn't know enough about these two to get upset, but I thought that this was a very interesting matchup when it was announced. I still do, honestly. The battle was a little too short, but it was still entertaining. Black Canary is a powerhouse, though, and I wouldn't mind seeing her come back. Being comparable to Shazam and Superman, I figured Black Adam had this one in the bag. Boy, was I wrong, and this one had a particularly brutal finish to it. Also, if I had a nickel for every time there was a death battle thumbnail with the character that lost portrayed by Dwayne Johnson, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it's happened twice. This was a really good episode. The composed fight track didn't really add anything to it, but the battle itself was great, and the rundowns got me really invested. This matchup feels a little weird since I think that Ethan Hunt would have made a better opponent for James Bond. Still, I thought that this was a pretty good episode, and I really need to watch John Wick 3 and 4. This was another episode with what I thought was a surprising result. I guess I'm not the only one who thought so, because the writers decided that Boomstick should have one of the best post-match reactions. I was hoping this one was fun, but wow, this one was great. The scale of this fight is something to behold, and I have to tip my hat to the animation team. Wings of Iron just might be the best fight track from Season 5, and it really sells the 80s feel of these characters. I also didn't realize seeing Optimus knee a Gundam in the chest was something that I needed in my life, but this really fun fight delivered on that. I love the atmosphere that Fairwolf Media's Widow's Kiss brings to this battle. Also, in terms of sound design, this has to be one of the grosser finales. I never got into Castlevania or Legends of Zelda, unlike one of my buddies who said that this episode felt like it was tailor-made for him, but the lore sounds pretty intense. This fight is incredible, and if you haven't seen it yet, go check it out. Going in, I did not expect this one to be my favorite episode from 2023, but here we are. Megatron's arc in the comics really surprised me. The fight looks absolutely gorgeous, again, thanks to Devil Artemis, and Brandon Yates's Final Formers is one of the best fight tracks from the last couple of years, easily. I was really excited to see how Needles Kane / Sweet Tooth would do against the Joker, despite knowing little to nothing about him. This went about as I expected, but I still had a really good time. I think this is one of, if not the shortest fight in the show's history. If it had been a little longer, I would have given the fight a 4 out of 4. This is a fight that I didn't know I wanted until it was announced. This is that personal favorite, like top 5 personal favorite, that I mentioned during Bill Cipher versus Discord that is one of the closest fights. I went into this one expecting someone's childhood to be ruined, but this is only the, 5th tie in the show's history? The lore for these two is absolutely insane, and I'm all for it. Another episode that was way better than I remember it being. I really need to read the Dark Phoenix saga again. I have it somewhere on my bookshelf. This one is pretty enjoyable, even if it was one-sided. I didn't know about Akuma's Oni form, but as a lifelong Mortal Kombat fan, I don't mind Street Fighter characters being fed to them, for the most part. I was not expecting to enjoy this one as much as I did. I really like how the fight writes Magneto in a more heroic light at the end, because once Tetsuo went all goopy horror, Magneto's victory was more of a mercy kill. This episode got me curious enough to seek out Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance. While I didn't end up liking the game too much, I do love the soundtrack, and this episode is still one that I come back to every now and again, even if the guy I was rooting for lost. Now this was a season premiere. It was also the first time DC lost to someone who wasn't from Marvel. I remember being really hyped for this one, so much so that I was late coming back from my lunch break because I needed to see how it ended. I was more familiar with Thanos going in, but as Darkseid's rundown went on, I had no idea he was that overpowered, and I realized just how screwed Thanos was. These god-slaying powerhouses clash for a surprising result. In my opinion, this is one of the best earlier episodes. I was surprised to find M. Bison the more interesting villain, despite being much more of a Mortal Kombat fan and player. This fight is one of those underrated gems that keeps flying under my radar. Tony's feats were amazing, but Lex's feats with robotics were just nuts. One hell of a fight, and I really enjoyed the gag of Tony having to pay damages to Pepper. You know, I'm starting to think Street Fighter lore is more interesting than I thought. I don't consider myself an animation expert in any way, shape, or form, but this sprite fight felt smoother than most of the others. Great job! This episode has one of the most brutal finishes in the entire series. Revisiting Hulk's feats, I'm not liking Godzilla's odds when they meet in a future episode. I had never seen any of the Kung Fu Panda TV material, but the movies are great, so I was excited to see Po come to Death Battle. This was one of the few matches from the 2021 season that I was genuinely excited for when it was announced. This is Batman's best episode, and it's one hell of a way to kick off the season of the most requested matchups. I was perplexed as to why they put Saitama up against Popeye, but as the rundowns went on, I said, oh, that's why. I kind of feel like this is what Deadpool versus The Mask should have been. The far superior Wonder Woman episode. I appreciated the nod to the Wonder Woman theme from the films in Thunder of Wonder, and I thought that this just overall was a great battle. I had watched the Stardust Crusaders and Battle in Egypt box sets by the time this episode came out, so I was pretty psyched to see Dio come to Death Battle. On initial viewing, it led me to eventually find Hellsing Abridged, and on revisit, it was a nice palate cleanser from Macho vs. Kool-Aid. This was another fight I didn't know I wanted until it was announced. When I first watched this one, I had no idea who was going to come out on top, and I didn't care because I would have been happy either way. This is my second favorite episode. I submitted the suggestion on the suggestion form years ago, thinking that there wouldn't be enough lore to cover these characters, and I just about dropped a brick when it was announced. One of the bloodiest battles in the history of the show, and it also features one of the most bizarre math calculations. I found the rundowns of these two pretty interesting, and I was pumped to see them fight. I figured Venom would win, and I wasn't disappointed. Sidebar, this was the first episode with merchandise director Mog Slothman, who they said they'd eat if it didn't work out. Whatever happened to Mog? Good Lord, Ryu's got quite the arsenal. This one felt really close. Keyword, felt, not was, and I was all for it. This fight is awesome. As someone who played the RoboCop vs. Terminator game a lot as a kid, it was great to see a 1v1 match between the two without plot dictating the winner. I gotta be honest, I'm surprised to see how high this one ranks with the criteria I set. I still had a really good time with this episode, even if one of my buddies summed it up best. They put a Ninja Turtle against a Power Ranger. What did you think would happen? As a longtime Resident Evil fan and a more recent Dead Rising fan, I was really pumped for this episode when it was announced. Would it have been the worst thing in the world if Frank West had won? Probably not, but I couldn't see any way that he was coming out of this in one piece. I'll be honest, I didn't feel the full excitement of this episode on my first watch. To be fair, I watched it on my phone, in my car, sitting in a Domino's Pizza parking lot in Yorkton waiting for my order. But it really grew on me over time. This was the last episode that was aired before Rooster Teeth shut down, and with the show's future being uncertain, this was quite an episode to potentially go out on. It was about time Predator came to Death Battle. The results here don't bother me because since they amalgamated all of the Predators into one version, it's only fair that they do the same with Boba Fett. And let's be honest, when was the last time that at the end of the day, the Predator truly won? Also, Theirwolf Media's If It Bleeds is a perfect blend of John Williams's and Alan Silvestri's styles from the respective franchises. It was this episode's announcement that got me to look up and subsequently become interested in Death Battle. If you watch the video of the live premiere from SGC 2014, no one in the audience seemed to be rooting for Gamera, which is hilarious to me. This is the one time that the percentage reflects my favorite episode. I love that this one is more out-of-the-box characters that I'm familiar with, i.e. not originating from comics, video games, manga, or anime. The rundowns got me excited for both, well, technically all 5 fighters. It has a great-looking 3D fight, and no joke, I listened to Theirwolf Media's Draconic Robotics multiple times a day for at least a year and a half once it became available. And that's my ranking of all the Death Battle episodes from 2010 to 2024 based on the criteria that I've set. The show has plenty of ups and downs, but the good far outweighs the bad, so I'm looking forward to see what they do with the 2025 season. What is your favorite episode? What is your least favorite? What is a matchup you'd like to see on the show? Let me know down in the comments, just keep it civil. Folks, if you've made it this far into the video, especially this video, I do want to thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to watch it. If you like what you see, give the video a like, subscribe to the channel, ring the bell for any future notifications, and share this video around. And until next time, this is JurassicKM, signing off.